Welcome to the latest edition of the Dana Discovery Dialogues, produced with support from the Dana Foundation. Today's topic is how the brain decides. This session is being recorded and will be available later on the Dana Foundation's digital platforms. Oh, and if you've registered, we'll also send you a copy of the link when it's up. The Dana Discovery Dialogues dig into the most compelling and relevant subjects in neuroscience, highlighting how the latest research influences everything from our personal decisions to how we deal with society's broader challenges. Today, we're going to look at what's behind our decision-making, what's going on in the brain when we decide, why is it sometimes hard to stick with those decisions? Why do our brains fall for misinformation? You'll learn about all those and more around the neuroscience of decision-making from our expert panel today. And a bit later in this session, we'll be taking your questions. And when you have those questions, please put them in the little Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, not in the chat. And do please feel free to put them in there anytime. I'll promise you we're going to get to as many as we can. So I'd like to first please welcome our speakers and have them say hello real quickly. Stephanie Groman of the University of Chicago Department of Anesthesiology and Critical Care and Neuroscience Institute. Hi there, Stephanie.
Hi.
Brian Knutson, who is a professor at Stanford University. Hi, Brian.
Hello.
Paul Glimcher, professor at New York University. Great to have you today, Paul. To start off, I've asked each of our speakers to share a bit about themselves and how they're thinking about the topic of decision-making. What animates your passion for this area? Stephanie, let's start with you.
Yes, hi, everybody. My name is Stephanie Groman. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Anesthesia and Critical Care at the University of Chicago. And so I received my doctorate degree in behavioral neuroscience at UCLA, or University of California, Los Angeles, and then immediately left to the East Coast, where I completed my postdoc training in the Department of Psychiatry and the Division of Molecular Psychiatry at Yale University. And so I've been both on the West Coast, the East Coast, and now I'm in the Midwest. And so my lab is interested in understanding how individual differences in decision-making kind of emerge, both in otherwise healthy individuals, but also in individuals with mental illnesses, such as schizophrenia, addiction, and depression. And so our goal is to kind of link these individual differences in decision-making with specific biological mechanisms, such as receptors or proteins that exist within the brain, so that we can understand how decision-making emerges. And so to do this, my team kind of assesses decision-making in rats using laboratory equipment known as operant boxes. And so we put these animals in these boxes and we ask them to play different kinds of games in order to achieve or receive these sweet treats known as sugar pellets. And so we can ask the rats to make decisions under different conditions or situations that we know kind of mirror the kinds of decisions or situations that we as humans often navigate. So for example, one of the tasks that we use in rats asks the animals to learn which one of many choices leads to a desired outcome. So in this case, this sugar pellet. Once rats can learn which of the choices gets them the sugar pellet, we do something that's kind of frustrating to the animal, and we change the contingencies, or meaning that we the previous choice that they learned got them the sugar reward now no longer gives them the sugar reward, and now they have to figure out which one of the other ones gets them the sugar reward. And so this kind of adaptable or flexible decision-making turns out to be very critical for our ability as humans to kind of navigate in our dynamic or ever-changing world. And so we're interested in this, particularly for using these kinds of behaviors in order to understand how a brain makes decisions, but importantly, how these decision-making processes might be affected in individuals with mental illness. And so our goal as basic scientists studying in rats is to understand how these differences emerge at the biological level in order to kind of help design new therapeutics for these disorders. And so my group kind of thinks about decision-making as a way to kind of bridge or translate our findings in rodents to potential treatments or therapeutics in humans.
Thank you. Brian, how about you?
Yes. Well, starting in grad school, I was trained in psychology and I was interested in emotions. But during one of 3 postdocs, I started studying the brain and ended up in the East Coast at NIH, where my advisor was silly enough to give me access to a brain scanner and functional magnetic resonance imaging. And so I started to look for signals related to emotion and motivation in the brain. And we discovered that we could actually elicit these signals pretty powerfully with simple video games involving money. And so I was lucky then enough to finally return to Stanford, and I've held on ever since. And when I returned to Stanford, I started talking to economists, and they were interested in this finding that you could use money to activate parts of the brain. And they introduced me to the notion of expected value, or the notion that, something might be happening that would predict choice. And then we started trying to predict choice with the brain activity, and we were successful. And actually, Paul's lab has been successful at this as well. And recently, we've started to really stretch to see if we can use that brain activity in groups of people to forecast market events out of samples, so choices in other groups of people. And so that's an area that we're very excited about right now.
Thank you. And Paul.
Sure. So I'm right now the chair of the Department of Neuroscience and the director of the Neuroscience Institute at New York University's Grossman School of Medicine. Like Brian, I started a long time ago. I originally was trained as a neurobiologist, and I had this idea that I really wanted to understand human decision-making, and that I was going to do that simply by tracing anatomical pathways from stimuli to responses in the brains of animals. And when I got to NYU as a young assistant professor, I found myself hanging out with a group of psychologists of judgment and decision-making, and they said, well, what you're doing is interesting. It shows tremendous naivety. You really should know something about how people make decisions, not just how to trace neurons through brains. And so I dragged myself through the bulk of the graduate curriculum in psychology here and became a professor of psychology as well. And then about 2 or 3 years later, as Brian knows, people like Brian started telling me I really had to learn economics. And so I repeated that process, dragging myself through our economic graduate curriculum and becoming a professor of economics. And so what really interests me is how differently different disciplines and different groups of people see decision-making. And I'm really fascinated by the idea that one can combine different approaches to the study of decision-making, and that the sort of union of these different approaches is more powerful than any one of those approaches alone. Over the course of the last 30 years, my lab's looked at a lot of things, but I'd say one of the biggest threads that's emerged for us in the last 10 years is that we've learned so much as a community about how the brain makes decisions. We understand so much better how the puzzling decisions we see in human behavior arise, how people are short-sighted, things like that, that these are ripe for clinical investigation. And my lab's really focused in the last 10 years on using the insights we derived in the first 20 years of the study of decision-making in the brain in clinical settings, in the treatment or diagnosis of depressive disorder, in the study and treatment of addiction, in the study and treatment of memory-based decision-making disorders like post-traumatic stress disorder. So my lab nowadays is about half a clinical translational lab operating in the clinics, and about half a very basic neuroscience lab that uses things like brain scanners and technical modeling and computational systems.
Thanks a million. So it was really interesting to hear, first from Stephanie about, how the brain is making decisions at a biological level and some of the individual differences. And I'd love to tease that out a bit more. And then also from Brian about groups making decisions. And I'd like to revisit that as well. And Paul, this notion first of combining approaches to looking at decision making and how that's more powerful than single approaches. That makes kind of intuitive sense, but I'd love you, first let's turn to you to just tease out a little bit more about a few examples of that power and how it is revealing to us some of our areas of decision making.
Sure, I would love to. When I was trained, the idea of how we would understand a behavior, like a rat in an operant chamber of the kind Stephanie studied, was that you really traced out the neurobiological pathways. You found the sensors that tasted that sugar pellet, and you figured out how that sugar taste got into the brain, and you looked at the motor components, the things that made you press that lever. And economists were always surprised that that was the way we, as neurobiologists, thought about decision-making. In fact, economists would say that was the least interesting part of decision-making. The most interesting part of decision-making, the economists argued, was how do you represent your choices and how do you weigh them? And I think really Brian was the first person to ask that question in a living human when he could win, and asked, what's that look like in the brain? And it spawned an enormous industry of asking, how is it that the different things I'm thinking about are represented in the brain? Now, that's a very economic idea. Psychologists had long been interested in the fact that people don't always make the right choice. Sometimes people are too impulsive, or sometimes people make decisions that are destructive in the long run, or sometimes they overweight the present. And I think that the idea that we could go into these representations in the brain and ask, well, gosh, how do they give rise to all these peculiar human behaviors? You know, there's been a temptation to think of humans as sort of dark, I think, making all kinds of terrible mistakes and being self-destructive. And one of the nice things neurobiologists bring to that as biologists is skepticism about the idea that humans are such dark, terrible animals. Biologists really want to think of animals as being smart and humans as being very smart. And so trying to sort of bring these ideas together, why is it that we do things that look crazy, that maybe represent us being sometimes maybe too smart for our own good? How are these things represented in the brain? How do we actually weigh them and make choices? This is all the kind of work that in the last 30 years we've gained tremendous traction on. The three of us could probably sit here for hours talking about our favorite little feature of each of these parts of the problem. And so I think that that's really, putting it together has really been immensely powerful.
Thank you, Paul. I'd like to build on this thought that you just shared about, humans doing something that maybe on the surface looks crazy, but is actually revealing that sometimes we're too smart for our own good. Brian, when we were chatting earlier, we were talking, I mean, before this panel, we were talking about, being able to sort of watch how decisions, watch the process before the decision is made in the brain. And I wonder if this would be a good time to build on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we live in a very, very fortunate time because these technologies became available, in both humans and animal studies too. And to just highlight two, one is the one I mentioned, functional magnetic resonance imaging. And the reason that was developed around 1993, that's the reason that's exciting is because, Paul talked about the process, the neural process. Things go into the brain, things come out. It allows you then to see things going into the brain, what's going on in between, and then things coming out of the brain, right? And so it's the in-between part that's really exciting, to a psychologist at least, and maybe to an economist, maybe to other people too. And so this now gives us a window, not a perfect window, but a window on what is happening, not just in response to having chosen something, but right before you're about to choose, seconds before, right? That's very exciting. And guess what? 10 years after that, all of these tools came online, which Stephanie can tell you more about, when you're studying animals, where you can not only visualize deep in the brain what's going on seconds before choice, but also perturb those substrates. So you can say in humans, guess what? I saw this area, whatever, the nucleus accumbens or something like that, uses oxygen before people take a risk. What happens if we perturb that in a rat using light? And that's, you can do that now with optogenetics, even though it sounds like science fiction. This is all possible. So you can really get not only predictive purchase on some of these questions, but also causal purchase on some of these questions. And we're just at the beginning of that process, in my opinion.
So I'd like to just pause you for a second there, Brian, to do two things. One is give us just a little bit about what is optogenetics,
Oh, sure.
You mentioned.
Yeah, sorry, I left you hanging there, right?
Yeah.
So I'm really lucky also in my position because I'm physically down the street from a guy named Carl Dijsselroth.
Roth, yes.
Who,
I know.
yeah, about 10 years ago, developed this technique, optogenetics, which is basically, again, miraculous. But what happens is they go into the brain to a specific set of neurons. They'll inject a virus in, which goes into the DNA of the neuron. Sorry, this is kind of geeky, of the cell of the neuron, which then produces a protein. And so the kind of protein they can produce in many neurons in the brain is an ion channel, which changes the polarity of the neuron, makes it fire. And basically, some of those ion channels can even be sensitive to light, like the ones at in the neurons at the back of our retina, right? And so what that means then is you can put in a fiber optic cable and say, okay, ion channels, open, close, just by shining a blue light or something like that, right? And you can have exquisite control over specific neurons and their firing. And this opens up, I mean, this is taken over basically neurobiology. Almost everyone's using these techniques. This isn't the only technique, by the way. They keep churning out techniques every year that are miraculous. So you're probably behind the curve here, but it's just an example of the progress, the technological progress that's happened in the last 20 years, which I believe has really informed the study of decision-making. So it's told us something functional about what's happening psychologically in animals, but also in people. And it opens up these new roads for translation across animals and people.
So quick follow-up for you, Brian, and then I want to turn to Stephanie. So first, what are some of the things we see before a choice is made? You mentioned a change in oxygen level. What are other things that neuroscientists are looking for?
So one of the drawbacks of fMRI is you can only look at where the oxygen is going, and that's sort of a proxy for what's active, we think, in a very crude manner of speaking. But you have this temporal resolution and you have depth resolution, so you can go deep into the brain. You can look subcortically at activity in regions that we couldn't see well before in humans. And so just to give you one example, because this is under review, it's very salient in my mind right now. We've been predicting very simple choices like gambling. Okay, so we'll present, and this is, by the way, and Paul's talked about this, gambling is how the idea of expected value started, right? So Blaise Pascal tried to improve the gambles of an Italian nobleman by inventing the idea of probability, basically. And so this is an idea that we all use in decision theory now. And the casinos use it, and insurance agents use it, and everybody uses it, right? But historically, the idea of predicting a gamble is a sort of a very basic component of decision making. Are you going to take the risk or not? Yes or no? Okay. And so basically, you can put people in the scanner, the fMRI scanner, and have them choose whether they want to take gambles or not. And we can change all kinds of things about the gambles, of course, the probabilities, the magnitudes, and so forth. But the basic brain idea is that, okay, we're going to measure activity right before they say yes or no, and then we're going to predict yes or no. And we're going to ask the question, which parts of the brain are more active for yes versus no? And it turns out, many labs have replicated this finding that before people say yes, there's an area of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, which all of us know about. It's innervated by dopamine projections from the base of the brain, the midbrain. When the activity goes up, you're much more likely to say yes on these gambles than no. There are other areas of the brain that we see activity predicting the opposite. So for instance, in the anterior insula, which is an old cortical region of the brain, we seem to see more activity that predicts that you'll say no. And so this is a lot of research that I'm summarizing in 2 sentences here. There are, of course, much else is going on. This is oversimplification, but I could, if you went into the lab and wanted to predict if I'm going to take a gamble, this is what I'd tell you to do. Look at those 2 areas right before choice, seconds before choice.
Yeah, thanks a million. I know it's always a little uncomfortable to try to summarize everything so tightly, but I really appreciate it. And we can always investigate more deeply, of course.
Absolutely.
I'd like to build on, what you've on the conversation with an element that's been raised. And I think, Stephanie, you were particularly well positioned to talk about this, which is we're talking about decision making in the brain, but one of the things you're looking at is individualized differences.
Mm-hmm.
And potentially how those could reveal some information about disease states or potential disease states. And I'd love you to speak about that.
Yeah. So a lot of the stuff that my lab is interested in is looking at why some people are more susceptible to developing an addiction than others. In particular, we know that a lot of people will take a drug of abuse at least once in their lifetime, but a very small subset go on to develop an addiction. So this kind of suggests that some individuals might be more susceptible or vulnerable to kind of developing an addiction than others. And if we can identify how that's emerging, then addiction might one day be kind of preventable, or we can intervene much earlier. And so we became interested in decision making as a potential predictor. And so it's been known for a long time that people who are exposed to drugs of abuse and animals that are even exposed to drugs of abuse have these really robust decision-making problems. But when we kind of started this work 10 years ago, it wasn't really known if these individual differences in decision-making that we were seeing in animals, whether that was kind of predictive of these outcomes that we were interested in. And importantly, you can see a lot of variability across individuals, but whether that is meaningful at the biological level or at the behavioral level is kind of, at that point, it was kind of debated. And so over the course of a couple of years now, we've shown repeatedly that we can assess animals in these decision-making tasks, show these individual differences, and show that those then subsequently predict drug-taking behavior. And so that's, to us, is really important, because one of the things that's often quite difficult to do is understanding disease processes in humans, because there's a lot of other things that are kind of going on within the brain. And so if we can kind of assess disease processes, with a proxy, something when they're not in that disease state, then maybe we can see the biology that kind of mediates that. So for example, with the addiction susceptibility stuff, we can start to look at decision-making, individual differences in decision-making as a proxy for addiction susceptibility. And so what are the differences? Are there differences in protein? Or like what Brian was saying, we can now look at how connections within the brain are formed and how the firing of neurons might vary between individuals that are making better decisions or worse decisions, or using this particular process to make a decision. And so we're able to kind of get at this biological underpinning that maybe isn't necessarily totally clear in human populations, particularly within disease states.
Thanks so much. I'd like to, I'd like to follow up on one thing. As Brian mentioned earlier, Stephanie, that you might be able to speak a little bit more to the tools, so the ways we're looking at, at the brain. And we talked about fMRI, and we talked about, but if you'd like to add to that, I think that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, Brian talked about optogenetics, which basically kind of revolutionized the tools that we had as neuroscientists. And so there used to be, I don't know, probably 20.
I'm going to add, just for our listeners, that
Yeah.
Stephanie's talking about tools that are used in animals, not in people.
All right, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Right.
So far.
Yeah, about 15 years ago, we were using a lot of pharmacology and lesion type of things, where we would ablate or take offline certain brain regions in animals and then see how that impacted behavior. But the temporal resolution of that was pretty broad, meaning that we take out this brain region, then that was it. The brain region never came back online. But with these optogenetic tools, we're able to kind of turn on and turn off certain populations of neurons with temporal specificity that is remarkable. And so we can turn them off and on in milliseconds and see how that impacts behavior, kind of test a lot of the things that Brian and Paul are seeing in the fMRI data. If you're seeing these things predicting behavior and you think that's what's going on, well, can we turn them off right before the behavior is going to happen and then see that the behavior is kind of lost? And so, we're not only able to kind of manipulate those, but one of the other things that's kind of evolved, again, from Carl Dieser's lab, is this approach, fibrophotometry, where we can inject a indicator into the brain that lights up when calcium comes into the neuron. And so this is a way for us to kind of assess neural activity by measuring the light that's emitted. And so this is what I would call, since Paul's here, a poor man's electrophysiology. But we can look at
quite the reverse. This is Star Trek electrophysiology.
And so we can look at changes in activity within these neurons as animals are awake and behaving, right? And so we can lock these signals precisely with these behaviors and say, oh, the signal's coming on right before the animal does a particular behavior and makes a certain choice, right? And so that specificity with kind of linking these things together, the neural signatures with the behavior, is something that we just haven't had until recently. And so those are really exciting approaches that a lot of people are using now.
So interesting to learn about obviously we have these very complicated things in our heads, all of us, animals and so on. And it's wonderful to learn about the new ways that we're looking. I'd like to go to a couple of little bit broader questions and invite any of the panelists to approach them, but I think you can't do a panel discussion in January without talking about some decisions people have made recently around New Year's resolutions. And many of us make them. We are not always, we think we've made a strong decision there, but we're not always good at keeping them. I wonder if there's anything we can say about what is going on there.
I'll volunteer to
Thank
start,
you.
but I know that both of them have very, very good things to say about this. One of the things that economists had been speculating about when we try and understand why is it that someone says, I'm going to eat only broccoli and turn away from the brownies for all of January. And they find themselves in a room with broccoli and brownies, and they find themselves eating the brownie. And economists always think about that as implying some sort of hidden cost to resisting the brownie. And I think that really goes with kind of what we believe, right? It's just having the brownie there. It's just hard not to eat that brownie. And over the course of the last, I'd say, 5 years, bunches of neurobiological and psychological labs have developed different ways to measure the costs we pay for keeping that brownie in front of us and not eating it. Candice Rao did a beautiful experiment. She's a professor here at NYU, in which she actually invited people to pay to have the brownie taken away. And she found that not only would people pay to have the brownie taken out of the room, but when people were experiencing a lot of stress, elevated cortisol levels, things like that, they'd pay more. And they'd pay more because they knew they were more likely to give in to the cost of keeping that brownie away. And more recently, people have been doing scanning experiments about this, showing where in the brain the costs are represented, developing the ability to predict at an inter-individual level what the cost each of us faces is. And it's quite different. Very experienced dieters not only seem to pay a slightly lower cost for sitting in front of that brownie, but they really know exactly how much that cost is. People who are inexperienced dieters often underestimate how costly it is to sit with that brownie, how hard it's going to be. And if you ask them, how much would you pay me to take it away? They often give you erratic numbers that aren't stable and that don't work terribly well for them. So I think that we've learned a lot about where in the brain these costs of, I got to not have any, I'm having a dry January and everyone in the room is having a drink. What's the cost of saying no under those conditions? How good are you at paying those costs? How good are you at paying others to mitigate those costs? And we know that people can become expert at that and that some people are better at it than others.
You're making me hungry.
I guess I'll chime in on the New Year's
These were fun
resolutions.
experiments. I have to, there were a lot of brownies in my lab in those days.
I'll chime in on the New Year's resolution. So this isn't our work. It's related to, all of our work, but it's work by Christian Buchel, who's in Hamburg. But actually some work we did before that, and then Paul's lab has done some of this work too, suggested that when you're considering rewards right now, you see a lot of subcortical activation, you see the nucleus accumbens, but when you start trying to factor in, what about versus this delayed reward, another reward far off in the future, maybe it's even more money, right? This is just money I'm talking about. You see this in subcortical activation, but you also see this sort of prefrontal activation. That suggests that maybe you need something additional when you're thinking about delaying rewards to be online, to keep you, waiting for that reward. So what's a practical implication of this with respect to New Year's resolutions? Well, let's say, for instance, I'm not doing this, I probably should. You forego a latte at Starbucks every day to save up money to go to Paris, right? And so one reward is every day it's a latte at Starbucks, but the other is like delayed. But it's much better. You could go to Paris, right? Are you going to succeed? Well, some people do, some people don't. We're all familiar with the, lapsing from these kinds of resolutions. And so how could you then use this information to succeed or have a better chance at success? So usually what people have advised is, well, you just need to exert self-control. You just need to inhibit your impulse every time you walk by a Starbucks for that latte, and be more rational, right? Figure out the cost of, or the value of the latte today versus, the vacation in Paris, and do some calculations, maybe do a decision tree, right? And then pick the thing with the highest expected value. That would be a rational way to do it. Most people don't do that for various reasons. They have limited time and attention and effort. What's another way? Well, what Christian Bouchel had people do is he said, well, imagine the vacation in Paris very vividly. Imagine how great it's going to be. Imagine having a glass of Sancerre at the edge of the Seine, and then maybe a beefsteak aux pommes, you know. And imagine every time you walk by that Starbucks, vividly imagine how wonderful that's going to be. And then see if you can put off the latte. And it turns out that it's much easier when people bring the future into the present to resist the present temptations than trying to put everything into the future. It seems like the same thing. From a computational perspective, it should be the same thing, but it's really different phenomenologically for people, and it's probably using different brain substrates that have to interact.
Yeah, so it kind of like sets it up very nicely. Thanks, Brian. We didn't plan that. But I think, you know, one of the things is changing your behavior is hard, right? I mean, everybody knows this. It's very easy to fall back into habits and patterns that feel comfortable and that are easy, you know, and the brain forms these habits because they think, you know, I think evolutionarily makes very like good sense that you can kind of like fall back on these behaviors that are just automatic, and you don't have to think about these things, or you don't have to do these evaluations, right? Evaluating the long-term impact of, you know, foregoing the latte, right? And you can just kind of fall back on these things. And so I know that a lot of people, you know, when I present this work in the rats, a lot of people ask the question, well, how do I improve my decision making? And I think that's still, you know, like an area of intense, you know, interest. People are very curious about it. They're looking into it. But one of the things that seems to kind of keep popping up in the literature in the field is exercise, right? So exercise seems to kind of improve everything, including decision making. And I think more recently, it's hypothesized that the reason that this is going on is that, you know, as we get older, our habits are more established, our brain becomes less flexible. We, you know, tend to be more rigid in our beliefs and our understanding. And that maybe what we need to do is kind of restore plasticity. And maybe that's at like the, you know, connection between certain brain regions, but that if we kind of restore this plasticity and then try to make these behavioral changes, they might be more likely to kind of stay. And so kind of getting back to this prefrontal nucleus accumbens dichotomy, you know, there's a lot of work now kind of focusing on the other end where plasticity is highest during adolescence and kind of these developmental periods when decision-making systems, we believe, are kind of coming online and you're forming these good habits and you know, before we become these essentially like rigid adults, you know. And so there's kind of this idea now that maybe if we can kind of restore this plasticity period, that maybe we'll be better at making these habits and you know, sticking with them.
I'd like to ask one other question along these lines, because, you know, just sort of building on this idea about you know, improving and our decision making sort of makes me think about snap decisions we make. For instance, a lot of us fall susceptible to misinformation. How do we decide that that is the way to go, or no? Is there anything we can say about that? Because that's obviously a big problem along all of our social platforms these days.
Brian, you have to answer this question. This is right up.
Yeah,
Well, I could go on forever, but this is like my pandemic hobby. Like now I have to study misinformation, right? So we are, but we haven't published much on this yet. But this also ties into neural forecasting, I think, because when you talk about misinformation, you know, a lot of other people have done great research on this, showing that emotionally charged communications, tweets, will spread further, faster, and it'll stick longer. And so there's something about not just the content, but the sentiment of the media products that seems to have a behavioral effect, not just in individuals, but at scale. And you could use that to say, okay, well, what kind of sentiment is it? You know, what matters? And that may vary by culture. My colleague Jeannie Tsai studies this, and we're looking at that in Japan and the United States. But at least in the United States, what seems to be viral on social media is what we call high arousal negative affect content. So this has a sentiment that basically makes you feel bad and aroused. And we have a lot of data on this over the last decade that, again, is in under review. But other people have shown this, so I feel confident in saying this. So then the question is like, well, why are people spreading that stuff, especially if it's correlated with misinformation, right? So this isn't exactly misinformation, but it turns out the more biased your media source is, the higher the diet of this high arousal negative content information you're putting out, or misinformation as the case may be. And those sources tend to have more misinformation. So this is all sort of associations, but everyone kind of is familiar with this pattern. Now, one idea from economics is that, well, if people are reposting this high arousal negative stuff, they must prefer it. But if you just look at people's media feeds, at least on social media, that's not what they're doing. We've sentiment coded all of this stuff. And what we see is like about a 2-to-1 ratio of positive to negative content in normal users. However, when they're hit with this high arousal negative content, they tend to repost it more, okay? So it's not a case, as far as we can see, of revealed preference in the sense that because people are reposting this more, they prefer it more. And I think that's an important distinction to make. And I guess the last, you say, well, what does this have to do with the brain, right? Well, it also turns out that we can look in the brain as people are looking at media, and we and other labs have done this. Emily Fox lab has done it as well at the University of Pennsylvania. And you could try to look at a group, neural response to these media, and then try to forecast how viral is that media going to be. And what she's seen with New York Times headlines, and what we've seen actually with YouTube videos, is that the more these activate regions that we've been talking about that are subcortical, that have to do with anticipating rewards and are modulated by dopamine, like the nucleus accumbens, the more viral they're likely to be, which also doesn't line up with the high arousal negative story. So there's sort of a missing link here of, we don't think that people are spreading this stuff because they like it, and we don't think that's their preference, but we do think they're being distracted because this is highly arousing, it's threatening, and we call it affective hijacking. And I can direct you to a paper where we say that. But the main idea is that these viral communications, some which may be misinformation and which we think are associated with misinformation, are hitting subcortical decision circuits in the brain. They are causing behavior that ensues not just in individuals, but also at the aggregate scale. And we actually need to get in front of this. We need to study this, and we need to get in front of this, because there's representation at the company level. The government's sort of behind, but there's really no representation at the consumer or the user level. And once we understand how this process works, we can develop tools to give to individuals, really, to offset this, we believe. It's not very complicated to think of the sentiment coding or analysis tools that you would need to build to allow people to filter the affective content of what they're looking at.
That is both fascinating and really hopeful.
I try to be hopeful.
Yeah.
Go on. Sorry, Paul.
No, that's okay. I want to highlight something that Brian and Stephanie both said that I think is really important. And it's this notion of habit, which is, I think, one of the fundamental insights from the neurobiological study of decision making. We know that I can give you a really hard problem and ask you to decide how to invest your stock portfolios, or here's a really hard menu you have to think about at a really complicated French restaurant. And we know that in order to answer that question, you're going to engage a lot of your frontal cortex, the parts of the most evolutionarily recent parts of our brain, some of the things that make us uniquely human, and that will burn tons of calories in those neurons trying to figure out how to weigh all these complicated things. But we also know that if you go to that complicated menu every day, as we repeat our path through that menu, we transition from using a really, really detailed frontal cortical mechanism to building a habit that lives in a more ancient part of the brain called the striatum, or the nucleus accumbens, a part of the striatum Brian was talking to. And so we see this nice handoff, which we now understand quite a lot about. As you make a decision again and again and again, make that latte decision that Brian talked about, again and again, you shift from using this rich cortical architecture, which is very, very deliberate and slow and complicated, to using this habit-based system. And that's a good thing. That's a very efficient way to shift our resources so that it's not hard to decide what to order when you walk into the Starbucks. To someone who's never been to Starbucks, that menu is terrifying. And to someone who's been to Starbucks a million times and knows they like the, strawberry macchiato, you know what you want, you go right in there and you get it. It takes a second. But as Stephanie pointed out, one of the things we've learned is it's very hard to go back to using this complicated cortical mechanism once you've laid down this habitized trace. And so there's been a lot of focus in labs like Stephanie's and mine and Brian's, trying to understand how is it that we learn to turn off habits? When is it that we can put habits aside, and how do we build new habits? And so if I was going to say there's one really interesting insight and answer to the question you asked, Mariette, it is we really now know how a hard problem turns into a habit. And we're really trying to learn how do we turn habits back into hard problems.
Yeah.
Yes, and I would add, this is so great because you can see how learning about the decision process causes us all to say, okay, what are the pieces? How do they fit together? What can we intervene on? It really opens up a lot of possibilities. But I would say, one idea is to dehabitize habits, but that's hard. You look at the speed with which people are processing these social media posts, it's under 2 seconds, okay? That means something neurally. That means you can only bring so much machinery online. So another way is to try to contest one habit against the other. So there are many possibilities here. I just want to, I like Paul's idea, but I also think there are many possibilities that we could explore. Sorry, Stephanie, you should talk about this as well.
No. I was just thinking, like, are you gonna have action competition? For like.
No, I'm thinking good versus bad. I'm thinking.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think this is the main problem. Like, for many years we figured out how habits are formed, and now it's like, okay, so now we're trying to go back, and it doesn't seem to be as it's not like once things are laid down, well, we're just going to erase them, right? Or we're just going to take them apart, take the scaffolding apart, and then we'll restore the brain to this naive state. It doesn't seem to be like that. There's a lot more, I don't know, something that's involved. And like, once you've like wired these things are kind of set up to operate this way, and we can't necessarily go completely back. But that, is one of the outstanding questions that we have. So.
Well, this is completely fascinating, but I see we have some great questions that have popped in. So I would love to let the, to bring some of the audience questions to the fore for a little while here. And maybe some of these are a little quicker to answer than others. I'm going to see how many we can do in the next about 10 minutes-ish. Question from Richard Ehrlich. Thank you. Is there not an issue of limiting decision-making to economic reinforcement? There are other types of reinforcement, including social, which impact decision-making in the brain. Also, there might be SES, I guess this means social economic implications as to decision-making. Please discuss. Yes, I see nodding.
Stephanie,
So.
Stephanie should start, because this is really.
Should I? Yeah, so there's so many interesting. So I think we've primarily talked about, like you said, like these economics, right? So even with the rats, it's, do you want this reward, right? This currency to the animal, that is very palatable and that they want. But there's a lot of work now looking at social reward, particularly in animals, and how choices can be made regarding that. And so we've known for a long time that animals that don't have social interactions for a period of time kind of develop problematic decision-making processes later on in life. And so there seems to be something important that goes on during the period when we're kind of developing these strategies during adolescence and early adulthood, that you need these social interactions to kind of form just very basic decision-making processes that are fundamental. And so whether these are all, presumably, I think, or at least I believe that they're kind of tapping into the same neural architecture. But it could very well be that they are tapping into different ones. But so far, it seems like there's very similar constructs, both across humans and rats, with fMRI data and the fiber photometry data that we use in the rats.
I want to second that. And I'm going to tell a quick clinical story. We studied economic decision-making, choosing between lotteries in people who were in treatment for opiate use disorder. These are people who are taking buprenorphine or methadone, two of the most important drugs we use to treat heroin addiction or other opiate addictions. And we found that their economic decision-making changed radically once in a while. Their willingness to tolerate ambiguous risks suddenly went through the roof. And they relapsed in their treatment usually about 7 days after this sudden change in their economic decision-making behavior. And I mean, we had neurobiological evidence that led us in this general direction, following what Stephanie said, that there seems to be some commonality of mechanism here. And nowadays, I'm running a full-scale or a mid-scale National Institute on Drug Abuse clinical trial where we use economic gains to predict when people will relapse in their drug treatment. And we call their physicians up and say, you've got a patient who's about to have a huge problem, and we're having, remarkable improvement in staying in treatment in our ongoing clinical trial, just from using economic behavior to predict drug-taking behavior. And I think that really speaks to this issue Stephanie raised, which is there are some commonalities in mechanism here.
Yeah, and I just add that in the neuroimaging literature, we're now at the point where we can sort of point towards specific areas in the brain and predict various types of choices, not just gambling, not just investing, but also like, are you going to help this person? Do you want to eat this food, and so forth? That's not to say they don't have different substrates, but it's not completely different. That is to say, there seems to be some common areas or circuits that we would look first if we wanted to predict these diverse types of choices.
Thank you. And here's a question from Valerie Darcy. Can you talk a little about what's known how physiological state, you mentioned being hungry, Brian, versus being calm or stressed, affects decision making?
Yeah, I can chime in, I guess. Yeah. So I think there's you can envision yourself, right, trying to make a decision when you're extremely hungry versus when you've eaten lunch and you feel fine. It's the process is quite different. And there's a lot of work in animals looking at kind of how these different essentially what we call states, behavioral states, kind of impact these choices. And so we know that animals that are in these stress states or have these have gone through a very stressful situation make decisions that look very different than they would in normal settings. And most of the time, it's usually kind of decisions that seem maladaptive or don't seem, optimal. And a lot of these now kind of a lot of the evidence kind of suggests it might be that these stress systems kind of come on and they kind of prevent this, like what we were talking about before, this like prefrontal control over this habit system. And so these decisions that kind of seem maladaptive are actually these habits that just kind of exist there. And that maybe the stress is kind of essentially kind of turning off this higher cortical system that we think is allowing us to kind of make these more complex decisions. And so, so there's a ton of work looking at that's interesting.
Here's another one, also related to sort of nuances around decision making. Can you speak to the influence on time delays between the choices and their outcome? We talked a little bit about the trip to Paris and how they might influence decision making. In other words, how does anatomical processing route differ between probabilistic discounting and delayed discounting? And please,
wow, sophisticated.
Don't mind. Yeah, thank you.
I'll say a little bit about what we call in economics intertemporal choices, which is would you rather have $10 now or $20 in a month? This is something that has been extremely carefully studied by neurobiologists. And I think the great puzzle that we struggle with as economists is, why are people so impulsive? Which would you rather have, $20, $10 now, or $20 in 2 months? Most of the undergraduates I ask that question of say, I'd rather have $10 right now. Now, I'll just remind you that $20 in 2 months resolves as a 600% annual interest rate. If I had a bank that would give me 600% annual interest, I would put all my money in that bank. And it's very common for people to say, no, thanks. And lots of people have studied this. I think the original idea, which came out of economics, was that there are kind of two parts of me. One part of me is very, very, very impulsive, and it just wants now. And another part of me is kind of more deliberative and thoughtful, and it's thinking about the interest rate. And I think a lot of labs spent a lot of time searching for those two selves sitting inside our brain. And basically the bottom line was we couldn't find them. There were some early reports that maybe they were there, but in that particular problem, it looks like it's not that simple. It looks like it's actually quite complicated, and that our complicated representations are as impulsive as ourselves. This is not always true. Brian's done some really beautiful work to show there are circumstances in which you can see two kind of different views of the world competing with each other. But this impulsive patient problem seems to be a really, really deep problem, and one that we see in animals across different phyla, we can see it in fruit flies, we can see it in rats, we can see it in lizards, we can see it in humans. We all show this competing feature. And I think it's really one of the fundamental questions that we don't know the answer to. Why is it that people show this impulsivity? We know now that all animals show it. We know now that it reflects a deep feature of the neural architecture. We can see the brain doing it. We can see people doing it. And I just think it's one of those $64,000 questions. Why is it? And we just don't know the answer.
Yeah, this is, I have to jump in, but I'll try to be brief. So this is one of those questions. I believe our data actually kind of reframes the question, can reframe the question. So I think traditionally the question is thought of as, well, if you were deliberative and you did all the calculations, there's no way you would not wait for that greater future reward, right? That's where the starting point is. But what if you come from a different starting point? You say, okay, we're all affective and motivated, and we think about what's going on now. Now, what do you need to develop to actually delay until the future? You need to develop some way of abstractly representing and planning for the future, right? And in fact, that's kind of what the newest parts of our brains are good at, right? And so that once you come from that standpoint, then that sort of flips the idea that, like, okay, now is the most compelling time. And our problem is we need to actually project that into the future. So that's sort of what I was trying to get at with the Paris vacation example. But I do think it's sort of knowing the machinery and thinking about the machinery allows you to sort of reframe the questions.
So I'd like to see if I can squeeze one more in before we start to wrap up. And this is kind of related from Ashley Zapp. How similar are the processes used to decide between, say, broccoli and brownies, so we were talking about before, and the processes used to make decisions in social contexts, particularly pro-social decisions in economic games? And how much does studying the first inform the latter? That was nice, related.
Stephanie, you should finish this one.
Yeah.
Yeah, so pro-social games. I'm thinking like there's been a lot of work by Steve Chang at Yale University looking at pro-social behaviors in monkeys and whether these monkeys, you can ask them to forego something for their buddy, right? So if they will forego, I'm trying to give like an example of like forego the brownie to give their friend the brownie, right? And they've shown some very interesting kind of situations in which monkeys will do those things compared to maybe not being as pro-social. And that has kind of, there's been an interest in kind of developing that in rats, these pro-social behaviors. And I think there was like a recent study, and I'm forgetting the name of the lab that this came out of, but it was, freeing their friend from, if a rat could free their friend from another cage, would they do that? And there's and from this group, they found that there was strong evidence that the animals could do that. Now, how those particular behaviors, whether they rely on the same neural mechanisms as these others, I think that's still ongoing. I would suspect that they do, that the mechanisms are overlapping. I think that these kinds of choices often rely on the same things. Now, where they differ is on the input, right? And where that input comes in. Rather than being a reward or something palatable, you have the social behavior that's kind of coming in. Maybe that's activating some other sensory systems that are kind of integrated in a different way within the brain. But essentially, when it comes down to the choice, they're kind of pulling up the same circuits within there. I don't know if you guys agree.
Yeah, I think that was great.
We have some data. So if you, I'm sorry, I can't resist.
This is great. Yeah.
If you look at giving to other people, giving money to other people, okay, which there's a game in economics called the dictator game. I think it should be called the giver game, but they call it the dictator game, where you get $10 and you can give some of that to somebody else, a stranger, right? We've looked at that in the magnet. Other people have looked at it in the magnet, and it turns out one of the best predictors of how much you give to somebody else is nucleus accumbens activation when you're looking at their picture. Now, here's something really interesting about this. If they don't have a picture, what happens, right? So you see a silhouette of that person. My student, Alex Janevsky, who's now a faculty at Rotterdam, did this study. It's on something called the identifiable victim effect, which is an effect in which you can visualize somebody, you're more likely to give to them charitably. And he looked at pictures of orphans versus silhouettes of orphans and how much do people give in the dictator game or the giver game. And it turns out you'll give 33% more if you see a picture of the orphan than if you don't. And guess what mediates that shift? Nucleus accumbens activation when you're looking at the picture. That's not to say the picture isn't activating a lot of other brain circuits, it is. But it seems that this area, again, that we would hypothesize should be related to anticipation of personal gain, also seems to play some role in anticipating giving to others, which is, of course, is costly. So there are other considerations there. But we have at least, I mean, our lab is not the main lab doing this. Alan Sanfey has done really great work on these sorts of gains, and Reed Montague. But there's a lot of evidence now using fMRI at least and these games to look at what predicts actually pro-social types of behaviors.
Wow, I really could talk to you all for hours. I think, you know, it's been super fascinating. I think we now have to start to wrap up. We have about 3 minutes to go, and I would love to invite each of you in any order you would like to share, you know, if there was one thing you would like today's audience to take away from the conversation, what would you share?
I think this is a good example of the breadth of neuroscience and decision making, right? Particularly this field. Like we've talked about, you know, social aspects, you know, neural mechanisms. We've talked about economic theory. We've talked about, you know, addiction and mental illness. And I think that just really kind of highlights how amazing the field of decision making is, and kind of what Paul got at the beginning of kind of bringing all these things together, and able to kind of address these very specific questions, you know, about how we make decisions, how decisions go awry, what factors influence decision making. So I think just seeing the breadth of this work is key.
Thank you. Any other quick thoughts?
I'm just gonna, at the risk of repeating myself, say one of the things I think it's so interesting that we've learned about in the last 10 or 15 years is this relationship between our frontocortical, very human, very deliberative selves and our sort of more affective, evolutionarily ancient habit selves. And this notion that we often have to transition from this deliberative self to this habit self just to live well in our society, but that this comes with costs, I think is one of the really interesting things we've learned in the last decade. That it makes sense to do it. There's a reason we evolved it. It helps us every day, but it isn't a costless thing.
Thank you.
I would reiterate what my colleagues said. If you're a good neuroscientist, you know you need all the methods and all the theories, and hopefully they converge. There is a there. We have convergence, where we are converging on common decision circuits that predict choice and probably will forecast choice too. And I hope we will do the right things with that information. And we plan on it.
Been just completely wonderful. And now I will be thinking a lot about how I'm negotiating with my deliberative self and my habit self as I go forward in the day. And I hope you all have really enjoyed the insights from our speakers today. If you like this, and you know, Tyler here will show you a card. We have a couple more of these dialogues coming up. We hope you can join on February 22nd on psychedelic assisted therapies, a growing and developing area, and March 24th on when brains and computers connect. I hope you'll be able to join us the same time, which is 3 to 4 Eastern time, and really look forward to continuing to explore the many-faceted world of neuroscience and society. Thanks again so much to our speakers today. It was really wonderful, and to all of you for your kind attention. Have a great day.